So, that's that shift to the level of wisdom that may erupt by being aware of the unwisdom in things. In other words, this deeper glimpse into the primary. That we have Eli, who says that God has been talking to you all along. Through your dreams, through your suffering, etc., because you're becoming aware of the fact that your everyday waking world of constructing the world is insufficient. Right? It's not sufficient. It doesn't account for the fullness. Right? Perhaps it's this issue of Jasper's issue between the night and the day. Those of you aware of his philosophy. So there's a balance between night and day, but things you see in the day, things you encounter at night, and so on and so forth. So now I want to ask a couple of questions, and we're going to turn gradually to the text. So what is the emergent issue that begins to emerge after Elihu? Is it possible to live with a radical unknowing and not escape into the schematic? How do you make that integration? That you have faced the open mouth of the pit, which you thought was God's mouth, and then you go forward and you don't close it real fast and say this was just an escape, it's just an error, but there's something true there. Putting it slightly differently. I'm trying to put it as sharply as possible, I hope. How do you live without the conviction of just balances and still live in a godly, pious manner? That the notion that there are no just balances is not just a theoretical issue about the schema, that there are measures and the pans sort of balance out at some point. But you are able to divest yourself of that, and you still realize that values have absolute claims upon relationships. Right? The fact that there is not necessarily a balancing in the universe does not mean that I can act any way that I want towards you. So what would be that which you perceive that would keep you in relationship to God, let us say, and to persons, so that you live without just balances or the expectation of some form of true retribution, reward and punishment, that has gone into your childhood. And now you have something else. And you still have to live. I'm not saying that's where you have to go in your life. I'm saying that's where Job is. Right? So the first is, how do you live with a radical not knowing and not close it up real fast with justifications, which is what the friends do. Right? How do you live without just balances and still live in a godly manner every moment? And where would you find the revealed truth to help you do that? Or the natural truth to help you do that? I think the book of Job is going to help us with that. Because he can't just leave you hanging in the abyss. Or I don't think he is, the author. And now coming back to the hardest question, which is not simply the theological question, but it's a hard question for theological anthropology that was raised at the beginning of the book, which was the challenge of the Satan. Is it possible, in light of all of this, where you still have a sense of the divine creator. It may not be the old creator God when you were 3, but you have a sense of the divine. And you serve God chinam, without any expectation. That was the challenge of the Satan. Ha-chinam, does a human being really serve God for naught, with no expectation? So in our reframing, can you serve the truth without any sense of balances and rewards? Because God doesn't work at that level. You imagined it, but perhaps it doesn't exist at that level. And even if you don't know it, what do you then do? Can you serve the truth for no reason except for it's the truth, even if everything in the world is the undertow to that truth, right? Without any sense of reward and punishment? So now, a primary question, and we're going to turn to the text. So if you don't know, if I don't know, if we don't know, because that's the key term in the book of Job, knowing. Knowing and doing. Right? Knowing and doing are the key terms. And the relationship between knowing and doing. Right? Those are the pivots that we've been talking around in so many different ways. So if we want then to serve without expectation and to live within this new vision that's beginning to open up, this is still before we talk about what that revelation is in 38. And I'm not going to put it not yet in the language of revelation. To whom or to what would you need to be attentive to live rightly? To whom or to what in this vastness, in this there-ness, would you be attentive to so that the there-ness takes on precious value? That's the question I'm trying to... And what difference would that attention make? Well, at the first glance, obviously, if you don't pay attention to these kinds of things, you just live in either a solipsistic or self-centered or anarchic universe. And we're trying to save ourselves from that without the hardcore Sinai and the law. But there's something that has to be salvaged for existence to have some kind of value, right? Even a tragic consciousness. So there emerges the divine presence to Job, which pushes Job's consciousness to the absolute limit through a new series of questions. And that, as I will hope to make clear, these new questions will begin to provide some answer, or at least I will give a reading of that, which tries to open up these kinds of questions. So let me just give it, and I want to... So first, let's just remind ourselves of something that I had said before. The power of the question. We talked about this several classes ago. So the power of the question is that it opens a path towards new thinking. The power of the question is that it puts oneself in the sense of not knowing. It's a primary stripping. Even the rhetorical question does that. The question opens up another possibility, right? Even though it may frame it in a limited way of knowledge, it's a question of whether that framing can push you as far as possible. And therefore, we're going to see that in the context of the poetry of 38 and following, God does not so much argue and does not even so much simply question, but he presents questions that are aporias. They're impossible questions. Because the impossible question has to make you break through into a different level of consciousness. It's not simply a koan, but it's pushing you beyond the question. Because the question keeps you standing firm. All the questions in the opening part of the book of Job, people are parrying around. They're like wrestlers, right? Trying to get a toehold, trying to grab onto each other even though they're covered with grease. Right? And they keep slipping around. But the divine question is to open up some new perception. And so it's a way of teaching by the question. It's a way of undermining the world without fully undermining the world, by helping the mind push through to a different vision. Not necessarily a divine vision, but an enlarged human vision. Okay? God doesn't ask Job to have a God-like perspective, but he's asking Job to have a different human perspective. Right? And not to have himself solely in mind, to be self-centered, but to be God-centered. But to be God-centered doesn't mean to have necessarily a relationship with God. But it's to have God in consciousness. Right? A kind of absolute awareness that affects everything that's done because of what's going to be revealed. Right? So we're going to come to this. But now notice how the new issue begins to emerge through the questions. So I just want to kind of focus on these things. So then God answers, right? Whatever that word means. God answers Job from the storm, right? Obviously, this has to be understood much more than the simple theophanic revealing terms of the old Near Eastern myths of God appearing in the storm. There is a deep whirlwind that has blown into existence. And now there's a voice that's being heard in that. Right? And it's more than the still small voice of Elijah that Elijah hears. Right? In which he hides, and Moses hides. The wonderful thing about Job is that he can stand there, and he doesn't run. Right? Moses ducks, Elijah hides, and Job withstands it. And perhaps that's part of the power of what's going to happen. There's a kind of courage to stand in the face of what we'll see as a different kind of tremendum. So what does God then say? He opens with all these new kinds of questions. Remember that Job began with the lama, which is the question of lament. And then he says, Mize, who is this who darkens counsel with words without knowledge? Right. This is not simply God hunting under the little bush for Adam. Right? Who is this? He knows damn well who is this. That is the first statement that has to be addressed. Who is this who darkens counsel? The imagery of the darkening of Eitzah with words without knowledge. Right? There is a deep wisdom in existence, this Eitzah, right? Who dares speak darkly words with no sense? Who covers it over? Who covers the truth over? with pretension. Right? That's the first call to consciousness. So, put on your wrestling belt, and that's really what it means, and I will ask you and you answer me. Right? I will ask and you answer. Right? So now notice what begins to unfold in the first sequence. We're only in chapter 38. A whole panoply of different aphoretic questions. Right? Apho, where were you when the earth was founded? Tell me and give me some knowledge. Right? Mi sam, who put? Or minata, who stretched out the cords? Alma, on what were its pillars set, he says. Umiyara, who threw down the plumb line into existence? And he goes on in verse 12. From any time in your life, hamiyamecha, did you ever command light to become light and day to become day, daybreak to break? Did you ever know where the source and the origin of shachar is? Right? It's not yet sun, it's not yet dark, it's the glow of light on the horizon. Do you know anything of that mystery of that glow? Can you command that glow? Right? Which is itself somewhat epiphenomenal. It's not even the phenomenon itself. Right? And he goes on. Right? 17. Were the gates of death revealed to you? I don't know how he says it here. People can look. Have you ever reached the depths of the sea, walked around have you been shown the gates of death, or seen the gates of death dark? Have you beheld the earth's expanses? Tell me if you know everything. Where is the path to where light dwells and darkness? Where does it belong? Can you conduct them to their regions, or imagine their homeward paths? Oh, you must know. You were born long ago. Have you reached the stores of snow, or seen the stock of hailstones that I have laid up for times of trouble? Now later mystics, for example, in 3 Enoch and others, they would have ascensions. And in this heaven they would know the source of the hailstones. And in this heaven they would learn the mysteries of snow. And in this one they learn the mystery of how God weaved the world. And what the texture is. Right? And in this heaven, where that glow comes from. So there are people who continue to dare for some kind of Gnostic privilege to know what cannot be known, through an ascension beyond the world. But you who walk with 2 feet on the ground, whose kids have died and whose house has collapsed and whose wife has died, right? Do you know any of these kinds of things? Right? Right? That's part of what he's asking. So this is a kind of new call to consciousness. Right? There's no, what can a human being say? What would be an answer that would not be asinine? Right? Anything that a person would say would be asinine. Particularly to a God who asks the question. So the fact that the poet takes on the persona of a God, divine voice, right? This is we haven't broken the frame of a human composition. Right? That's part of the wonder of this text. We haven't broken the frame of a human composition. But in any case, what could you know? And what is the meaning of that? Who cracked the channel for the torrent? Does the shower have a father? Who begot the drops of dew? From whose womb did the ice come? Who gave birth to the sky frost? Now try to feel that. This is biblical hermeneutics talking here, right? This is your call-in host. Can you hear biblical hermeneutics? Right? And why do I say that? I think here there's a power of the question and metaphor that's undermining myth. Right? Who begot the drops of dew? Goddess so-and-so. Does the shower have a father? Yes, indeedy. And I'll pour some water by my altar to stimulate my Father's pouring water into the world. Right? I live in the world of natural myth. Right? Can you feed the wasteland? So I'll plant a little plant to Adonis. And I'll pour little drops of water every morning and I'll say, Adonis, Adonis, come and show your flowers. And God, Adonis, who is the deep seed in the earth, will smile on me with a seed. Right? So I live, there are answers to this, and the mythic consciousness gives deep, deep wisdom because it wants to live in the inherent rhythm of existence. The power of myth is that while it's naming things, the womb of the true mother, right? Right? Mother of all, giver of all fruit. Give us blessings. Right? There's a power of that mythic notion that transcends the theological notion of the cosmic mother, the cosmic father, the gods of the mythic world. They're there inherent in the deep structure of things. And if you name them rightly, you've named the truth of being. That's the power of myth. Right? If you've named it rightly, you are in accommodation with it. And then you know how to pour the water, say the right words, do the right gestures, and you're in the cosmic canopy. And who doesn't want to be in the cosmic canopy? Which includes death and birth. But if you know the secret of birth and death, and that death is a consolation because there may be life, then you've got some kind of a wisdom that you've been taught that gives you a consolation beyond what human mortals wouldn't have otherwise. Yeah.
Did you just make a distinction between the cosmic canopy and what you said earlier about the sacred canopy?
I'm hoping that you would bring them together.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I think that I think the human canopy, the religious canopy, is simply a more modern form of what the struggle was to find this cosmic canopy. Right? I'm not sure that all of the revealed religions, the mystics do, but most of the revealed religions keep you within the realm, keep you under heaven. They don't open you up necessarily to a cosmic consciousness. The mystics add the power to the traditional religions by widening to a cosmic consciousness. And then their balancing act is how do you remain moral when you have a cosmic consciousness? It's going to be Job's issue too, right? Because he's going to be faced with a new kind of post-mythic post-covenantal cosmic consciousness that's not mystical. And he's going to have to try to live with that. So part of what I'm suggesting is that if you attend to this language of the biblical hermeneutic, you're attending to something of the power of metaphor that's breaking open what these same images produced in a mythic world. It's breaking them open, right? Because you realize that you're a stranger in the cosmos, right? You are there by the grace of God, and you don't know. At the most, by the grace of God. So you don't know. You have no, in other words, your whole mythic consciousness and any kind of religious notion that borders on mythic consciousness is taken away from you, right? And the metaphor becomes these new broken myths that you have to live in. Can you live inside these metaphors? Right? That's the new question that's being opened up. Can you enter that question? Does the shower have a father? Who begat the drops of dew? And live inside that as a new teaching. So the first, and I think there's going to be more that's going to be said as I'm going to try to articulate, but this first notion is to push the mind to the mind's limit. So the person can't answer and has to stay with the images. Has to somehow find a new balancing point that's not an answer. Right? And he asks it even in personal terms. Here at the end of 38. Do you hunt prey for the lioness? Do you satisfy her young? We're already beginning to get some mysterious new notion of what divine providence is. You may not like it, but when a lioness hunts prey for her children, there's something of the providence of existence that's going on. Right? When they are crouching in their lair, sitting in ambush in the covert. So who created the lioness who pounces and eats and crushes? Who? And what is the nature of that providential core of existence, of this search for continuity, this search for food? Right? Right? Who puts prey in the raven's way? 38:41. When her fledglings cry to God, wandering aimless without food. This is biblical hermeneutics. It's a different kind of way of thinking. Who puts the prey in the raven's way? Think about it, right? This is not just casual language. It's telling you something about a different kind of providential order that you've got to get your head around, or else you remain self-centered. Right? This is before he's going to come to the larger part of 39. When her fledglings cry to God, right? Wandering aimless without food. Something. Is there something of the protecting of the young, of the hunger and the searching for the food, this pouncing and eating, which is something of an attribute of God? Right? It's something of God's attribute of creator. Right? Not what you thought you knew 20 years ago, but something that's being spoken about in this poem that is something of God's attribute of creation in the world. Right?
You know, there is an unease there. Why does he choose that voice, which seems to be lifting the other voices throughout Job to another level? Because we've heard these motives. God is so much greater, and now you have God speaking from the whirlwind, almost showing his muscles. Look, you're a worm. Why didn't he choose the voice of the prophet? The mercy, pity. I'm a God who takes care. Because this is a fundamental lack when I read of compassion, of pity, of the other taking mercy. And the end only exacerbates this lack. As I maybe
I don't know how to answer the question. For me, it's very powerful that it remains a human voice under heaven. The poet has reached a high level of spiritual insight. And so he speaks from a transcendent perspective. But if it came from some truly divine realm, right, and not a human consciousness of the divine realm, but if it came from a truly divine realm, I think the book would be trying to do what people always want Scripture to do, to talk about truth with a capital T. And I think the book is trying to convey a new kind of wisdom, and not truth with a capital T. It's a wisdom born of a new perception of the truth in existence, but not truth with a capital T. So that's the only way that I can answer. Because if the voice was truly a prophetic revelation, it would just wipe away even the kinds of ending that we're going to see. But let's hold that. I find a great poetic power in this fact. And that the fact that it's a divine kind of persona makes it different than the friends. So he's not just saying, you worm, smash you, because their stance is a fatuous stance. Right? It's a fatuous stance. And the stance here is different. He's asking Job to enter into these images and to try to live with those images and the truth that's conveyed in that. They're not myth, and it's not just words. The metaphor is some kind of perception into as far as you can go as a human being. Right? It stays within the realm of spiritual poetic insight. But the fact that it's in the persona of God allows us to imagine that there's a widening of that question. Human beings, or we could say it differently, it's a rhetorical strategy. Human beings argue, try to convince, bang you into submission, argue you into a corner. And the divine voice here is not yet sinking existence. We're going to come to that. But at this point, trying to change your mind by asking impossible questions.
Well, wait.
Yeah, please.
But it's the lack of mercy.
Why should God have mercy?
I perceive. The
what
voice of God.
What does mercy have to do with any of this?
I perceive the voice of God in Isaiah or in the prophets. There is a God that speaks because it's all about suffering. There's no compassion.
Maybe this is compassion. Why is this not compassion? Maybe this is. He's giving Job some kind of an answer that's consolation, that's compassion. Whether Job can stand and absorb it is a different question, right? But maybe there are different ways of thinking about mercy and divine compassion and care, right? So I think that's something that you guys have to think about, right? But there's no reason why this could not, and it's not tough love. It's I wouldn't have used the word mercy and compassion, but the divine voice is speaking to a person to help that person. What greater love could a divine voice have? If that's not compassion, I don't know what it is. Or it is included in the framework of compassion. But as with all things, it's to whom you talk and how much that person is ready to hear. That would not have been compassion to Job in chapter 3, or 4, or 5, right? So when you walk into suffering, you have to know what to say and when. That's the wisdom of compassion, right? So we've been schwitzing over this for 8 weeks already, right? So we're maybe beginning to get ready for this.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that I agree on some level that mercy and compassion aren't excluded from Job chapter 38 through 41. But what concerns me is that I feel like we could have, in a way, expected this response from God, and it seems to fall into a similar, it's still like I'm wondering what's the particular insight in Job 38, right? That doesn't fall into the same trap that his friends fall into, and basically it basically sounds like God is saying, look, my ways are higher than yours, and my thoughts are higher than yours, and I guess I wonder if ultimately that is consoling, right? If ultimately knowing that God is the creator, which is presumably something that Job knew before this, where does it take Job?
So you don't find this something new? The world of creation is out there, but how do you stand in relationship to it? Right? It's not like there's going to be a new world. Right? So how do you get your head around the proportions that are being now given? Everybody's different. I don't think I've ever read the book where turning to chapter 38 didn't come as a jolt. So there's this screaming, I wish I had a mediator in heaven who at least represent me because no one's listening to me. So if someone has to deliver my email to heaven, there's some kind of a cosmic scam going on. I wish I had a mochiach, fix up the cosmic computer, make sure that it gets through, right? Text me again, says God, right? Hear it. Jammed, I don't know how to read your messages. Are you all right?
I guess I'm wondering from a pastoral perspective, right? Can I offer Job 38 to someone who is suffering with who has gone to who has seen the abyss, as we've said in this class, right? And say, this is and would that be a authentic consolation for their struggle? Because I don't want to say something pastorally cliche to say, well, God is the creator of the universe, right? And where were you? All of these things are above our understanding. And so like I guess that's the fear that I'm thinking about. Is that like I want to be authentic.
I'm not a pastor, and I don't know how to do these things, and so all that I could say to you is, no, I wouldn't say this to any person who's suffering, but if you absorb this, you'll be a better pastor. Because I don't think it's a matter necessarily that you give this over as a teaching to a person who's just gone through hell, right? That would be stupid, I think. But if you absorb this, you're going to know how to measure your words. You're going to know something else, I think. So I think there's a difference about the wisdom that you can gain as a give pastoral care. That's part of your spiritual journey. And then you have to meet the sufferer where the sufferer is. Right? That's the whole crisis of Job and his friends. They weren't meeting each other at that point. Right? So, I don't, isn't that part of the whole task of education, right? It's not just pastoral learning. You get all this to be ready for the new moment that you have to deal with. It includes any book that you're reading, right? It's not like you know what the moment is and how to respond, but you try to gather wisdom so that when it happens, you can do something with it that comes out of a richness of insight. Right? Otherwise, everybody has a little a spiritual algorithm, right? When the weather gets below 30 degrees and people get cold, you do X. Right? Well, some people like to live that way. What can you do? I don't know. There's a lot of people on this earth. So, right? We have to. So the voice is different, right? The voice has to be different, but that doesn't stop you from this kind of deep learning. You have to be ready for that new moment and know what that wisdom is. But I would agree that one of the great mysteries is to know how to comfort the needy. That's one of the great wisdoms. But you can't do that unless you've got someplace in your own life. I mean, right? That is one of the great wisdoms, to comfort the needy. Right? It's one of the great wisdoms. But who's up to the task? So,
what would you recommend the friends say to Joe after hearing 38 to 41?
well, we're going to come to the end. Let's see what they. I don't know what they hope. We'll see that he does something to them that I think does change them. You'll see. At least I think. So it's not what they will say something. Yeah, but I'm going to let the book of Job say what he has to say.
Just kind of a question. Maybe there's not a real answer to it, but I found it interesting to talk about how the metaphor shatters the myth, or it undermines the myth.
Yeah.
And I wondered,
Oh, keep going. I'm just getting that sun.
because we talked about the law earlier on, and I wondered, is it also undermining the law, and how is the myth and the law related at this level?
Well, I think that it's including that, but
Okay.
but this. He's not addressing the law as such, but everything that's happening is shifting the ground away from the law.
Yeah.
Yeah. The undermining of these cosmic mythic images through the metaphor is one thing. But this whole way of divine speech is simply shifting the perspective. And so it's not necessarily an undermining, but it's changing the sphere. So let's take a look at a couple of other things, because then I know that as we get to the end, people are going to want to jump in. So again, he has in 39, do you know the time when these kinds of animals are born and the antelope gives birth? Now I want to I already had hinted at this mystery of a new form of divine providence. Or don't call it providence, just another way. This is all from God, right? So, right? That's part of what the text is saying. It's not from one of God's cosmic clowns. This is from God, right? God is saying this. He hasn't deputized, the goddess of antelopes to give birth to antelopes and the goddess of ostriches to take care of ostriches. This is all from God, right? So we have to remember, he's saying, he's trying to help you focus on what you weren't noticing. Because you were noticing your own suffering. Now the first focus is think about the cosmos and its mystery. You can't even get your head around the question. And now Genesis 1 first talks about this high heaven and da-da-da-da-da. And then all of a sudden, it turns to the creatures of the earth. So now he's asking you, think about these creatures of the earth. So you have, Job, a certain notion of human nature, of animal nature, of nature. Now, pay attention to some stuff. So I'm just going to look at a couple of these first 4 or 5 images. And I want, now these are not just metaphors that you're asked to habitate or inhabit. Now we're given many, I don't know what to call it, maybe like these have become poetic ideograms of the world. Right? Take a look at the wild ass, at the antelope, the stallion, the ostrich. We're going to take a look at them. These are kind of ideograms of divine wisdom. Not maybe the kind of wisdom you thought it was, but these are ideograms of wisdom. If wisdom is an attribute of God, it's the true attribute of God, then these are aspects of the attributes of God. Okay? You're used to thinking of the attributes of God in terms of certain forms of mercy and this and that. But let's take a look now at the antelope and the ostrich as extensions of the attributes of divine wisdom. Right? This is the issue of creationism is irrelevant. The issue of just think about this in totally different ways. Just think about this now, the way it's being presented here. Do you know when the antelope gives birth? So this is biblical language. Watch for the calving of the deer. Do you count the months they have come to pass? Do you know how when their time has come they crouch, split open for their young, release their newborns. The calves thrive, grow in the wild, then leave them and never return. So that's the first image. Okay. There's some mystery of the pregnancy of an antelope. But the antelope knows, because the antelope says, I've got my rights over my body. So the antelope knows when it's time to open her womb. She knows her body, right? And so she knows when to crouch and when her womb splits open and little baby deer come out. Because it's an innate knowledge that she has, which is part of the divine wisdom that God has given her. Right? It's part of God's attribute of wisdom that's now coming through antelopes. Did you ever think that the attributes of God are in antelopes? So think about it. And then they grow, and she says, sayonara. I don't care whether you eat mulberries, you find food, I'm on to another pregnancy. Bye. God created the antelope. She doesn't care for her young forever. Right? Was she self-centered? She was reading a book and said, I got to take care of myself?
Mm.
No, that's just the way antelope's antelope. Because that's the way God gods. Right? That's the way antelope's antelope. Don't look it up in an encyclopedia, that's just the way antelope's antelope. And what about the wild ass? Did you give the wild ass his freedom? Running around the wasteland, the salt flats, scouring the hills. That ugly wild ass, he created in the image of God. Right? He doesn't give a hoot. And if he finds an antelope to eat, and he has some ketchup, it's all the better. Right? Goes to some kind of a cosmic kiosk in the wasteland. Do you have any ketchup for my antelope? Because the wild asses. Right? He doesn't have a GPS system to find his antelope, but he has it in his body. Because it's an attribute of God. And how about the buffalo? Can you trust him to bring in your produce? Hello, Mr. Buffalo, you my friend. I'm going to tame you. I'm going to tame the buffalo. Can you rely on him for all his power? Be my friend, Mr. Buffalo. Well, buffalo's buffalo. Right? And now look at the ostrich. God creates the ostrich too. What kind of a weird bird. So if you look it up in your taxonomic chart, you say, is it a stork or is it a vulture? It's a storko-vulture. Right? That's what it is. I'm an ostrich. I'm a storko-vulture. And look what I do while I'm doing my ostrich thing. I put my eggs on the ground. I warm them in the sand. I'm taking care of my little eggies. my kitties, my ostrich kitties. And I'm so stupid, in your terms, that I don't even know that Mr. Buffalo is going to come by and smash them under the ground. Like, right? That's my wisdom. I'm caring for my little ostrich eggs, but like I don't have a clue that they can be smashed. So they can be crushed by feet, trampled by beasts. Now look what he says. Yes, God deprived her of wisdom, created her without sense. There are dumb asses and there are dumb ostriches. Yet when she runs up a hill, she can laugh at stallion and rider. An incredible poet. Right? She's a dumb ostrich. Looks like a goofy thing. You don't know what it is. Stork or a vulture. Doesn't even know how to take care of its little eggs. Right? And God gave her an ostrich brain. So she is stupid at one level, but when she has to run up a hill, she can save her life from a stallion. Right? So that's also from God. It's also part of God's providence. He deprived her of wisdom. He made her a dumb ostrich compared to something else. But she just does what the ostrich does. Or the stallion. Right? Or then this vulture who takes wing for your wisdom down by 26, 27. Spreads his pinions. Does the eagle soar at your bidding? Hello, I've got some ice cream. Come on down. Building his nest on high. From there he seeks food. His eyes peer far. His chicks lap gore. Where there's a corpse, you will find him. Right? Look where the poet is trying to get your head. Right? This eagle. Eagle eyes. Sees things way up. But what does he see? Dead flesh. Because that's what the eagle eats. Right? And God keeps it going. God keeps it going. And don't tell me it's not nice. Just God keeps it going. That's part of what God is saying to him. Right? So you don't tell the eagle when to fly. You haven't got the foggiest idea how an eagle can see from such heights. And to see flesh of a little rodent or some decaying flesh. Where there's a corpse, you'll find him. So then God turns back to Job, right? He's giving Job a little bit of a vision of things. And Job says to God, after God sticks it to him, yeah, I see how little I am, I can't answer you. I'll keep quiet. But God's not done. Right? So God's not done. So now, in that first instance, we first had this vision of the cosmos and the sky and the moon and the rain and the wind and all that stuff. And then we have this vision of birds and animals, and look what he's chosen, right? And now God's going to say again in verse 40, beginning in verse 6. No, so tighten your belt a little bit more. You didn't have it cinched up well. We're going to go back into the ring. Right? I'll put some more questions. See if you can answer. Would you annul my judgment, make me guilty, so that you were in the right? Now, just so that you can win your human perspective, you're going to say that I'm wrong? Right? You see, feel the power of that statement. Right? Just so that you can win, are you going to pervert everything that's going on in the world to keep your little puny perspective? So now what does God do? He brings out these two cosmic beasts. Right? So now we're brought to some kind of phantasmagoria of mythic images. Right? We have Behemoth, right? And we have Leviathan. Welcome to the cosmic tent of God, ladies and gentlemen. Right? You've just seen my vultures who eat the gore of the earth because I, God, feed the hungry. Right? Did you see that? I feed the hungry so the eagle can see decaying flesh. Right? I, God, feed the hungry. And now, welcome to the big top. I'm going to take you into the big top. You've had a little look at the hail and the wind. And you couldn't get your head around the hail and the wind. You can't get your head around an ostrich. Because you think you know what human nature is, that moms take care of their babies. Or they know how to hide the eggs. Or you think you know what it means that God feeds the hungry. Or what eyes are for, right? But then you don't know what eyes are for if you don't see what eagles see. Ravens are looking for dead flesh. There's something about, don't have to call it providence. Call it something else. Call it the attributes of God's creativity. But not in your terms. That's what God is now saying. Are you going to make me look bad so that you'll look good? Come on, get with it, Job. I'm God. So you want to win the argument? Win the argument. But then don't pretend you're having a theological discussion. You just want to win. So now we have the soup. So the poet now lets out all the stops. And he goes for the big top. Right? Welcome to the cosmic circus. Big, big behemoth and big, big Leviathan. Right? Everything about them is enormous. Eyes and nose. Right? Look at the river beast. Look at his thighs. Right? That's actually, there's a euphemism. It's really, look at his penis. It's what power, the might in his belly muscles, his tail, his thigh thews, twisted tight, bones, limbs. He's the first of God's ways. Right? Right? So, God also gives birth to things. Let none but his maker bring forth a sword. So he eats and he snorts and he roams around the old muddy ground of the first days of creation, snorting up the water and eating things, not wiping his mouth, not eating with manners, right? Sheltered, so and so. He gulps up the whole river. Can you catch him? Can you pierce? So now we have this vision of this fantastic, the world of the fantastic, the mythic fantastic. Everything taken now to this cosmic degree. Something astonishing. And then he switches to the Leviathan. All these images. 41. He sneezes and he makes the light shimmer. Right? Like he blows the circuits in the sky. Right? His eyes are like the eyelids of dawn. Who talks this way? Because he's trying to get your head into this. Right? Who sneezes and the circuits that God keeps the world light go dim? Right? Got to get a new electrician, says God, so that the behemoth doesn't blow my circuits. His mouth, from his mouth come torches. His eyes are like the eyelids of dawn. Right? His nostrils smoke. So you're being brought to some level of the tremendum and wonder in poetic terms. So we're brought to something else before we turn to Job's response. This is simply God singing the song of creation. That is an extension of God's godding. Right? That's just all it is. God gods with an ostrich the way ostriches do it. And then he gods with the ravens the way ravens do it. That's part of the mystery of God's godding. Right? He gives food to the raven. It's a different mystery of creation. Out of God's mouth comes the nomos of being, not the nomos of the law, of the covenant. It's just, this is what God is saying. God is giving you ideograms into the mystery of God's, the way God has hung things out in the sky, hung animals out into the earth. Right? So do you say, well, that ostrich is not a creature of God because ostrich is so stupid to plant their eggs under the ground so they'll be crushed? Would you say that? Okay. So maybe it's not providence, but there is a new sense of form and substance that comes from God's attribute of wisdom. Each in its own kind, each in its own way. Right? And the way it flows is not the orderly creation of Genesis 1, is it? It's just hanging out there in the way that you really see it. But now by raising it to the level of poetry, you're brought to a new consciousness. And the self is decentered. The self is addressed, but there's nothing that's said about the mystery of the human being. The human being is not the crown of creation, and no more in the image of God than the raven. Right? So in the back of our minds we begin to wonder, what is special about the human being? Is it to come to this level of consciousness? To be addressed by this kind of new possibility? But also we're becoming aware of what Job has to be aware of. He has no claim on God. Right? All the preceding arguments would presuppose you have a claim. You can make a claim. How do you make a claim on a God who creates such a stupid ostrich? But that's so mysterious. How do you make a claim against the God who creates the eagle that eats carrion? who are you talking about, right? The whole notion of nature and whether there's what the wisdom of nature is not in your terms. So now the question that we have to face, because we're the human beings right at the end of the day, and we have to take Job's perspective. What do you do with such overwhelming perception? What do you do with that? What is to be done with such overwhelmingness? What is the shudder now of this new tremendum? It's different than losing your family. But there's a new tremendum that's opening up, of having seen all of this, that God has revealed this, or the divine voice has revealed this. So if the first case in chapter 3 is that Job had this disposition towards the there-ness, in the first instance, the disposition is to plenitude. Plenitude, which is just massive forms of power and being, each with its own kind of value. Right? And there's a different kind of humility that emerges from that. So, what would a human being say to that? That could allow you to turn back to the world. So I have my own particular reading of 42:2, which I want to share with you. So let's go at 42. So God again answers Job, and he says, Job answers God, so I know that you are almighty. You have a new notion of almightiness. Right? That you are almighty, overwhelmingly almighty. And nothing is absent from your conception, from the way you, right? But we're now brought to some hint of the divine mind that makes itself felt through the ostrich and the raven and the wild stallion. That is part of God's all-powerfulness. And then God roars back again, who's darkening all this with stupidities. And Job says, at the end of 3, he said, I've seen wondrous things, something that exceeds human, it breaks my head open, the wonders. I'm split into something spectacular, the wondrous. And I don't know what to do with it. I didn't have any way of thinking about this before. So God then says, listen, I'm going to speak. Now Job comes to the climax in 5 and 6. I've heard about you with the hearing of the ear. Right? I got an echo of you from tradition. I heard what was passed down. What providence is, what divine care is, how God feeds the hungry, how God does things. Right? I heard about you. But now I see into it a little bit differently. have a new perception about what's going on. Because he's been shown this vision of being, right? That language of 38 and 39 and 40, he's been shown something, so he sees it with insight, right? And then he says, Al Kain, in the Hebrew, therefore, Em as v'nichamti al afar ve'efer. So, endlessly translated. So I treat myself, I feel contemptuous about myself, I recant, I regret, Em'as v'nichamti, because I am simply afar ve'efer. I am simply dust and ashes. But I don't want to leave it like that. If Job has simply said right before, I've seen something new, I'm not sure that the only answer is a statement of human humiliation of everything that he was before, that he humiliates himself before God. Maybe that's what it means, but I don't want to read it that way. I don't think that's where I want to go. So I want to read it, verse 6, in two ways. I think it's a complex, bivalent pun. But it's going in two different directions, because the language itself. So, read at one level, and the meanings of these two verbs means, so, having seen this, I despise my former position, and I regret what I have said with respect to human beings, afar ve'efer, with respect to those who are simply flesh and ashes. I regret all the things that I said because I only spoke from a puny human point of view. But then there's another way to read this, because nichamti does not simply mean I regret, that God uses that word when he says I regret that I created people right before the flood. But the same verb also means to have compassion. And so he's also saying, I relent and have compassion for those who are of dust and ashes. As he immediately turns his theological insight into an ethical insight. The theological insight is I regret and I let go of what I said because of my meagerness, being simply dust and ashes. But I'm also now compassionate for all those who are simply dust and ashes. He has taken his insight into the vastness and turned it into compassion for all those who live within such an enormous universe. Now then we have something quite astonishing, which I think helps us understand the conclusion in a new way. So, and the clue comes in verse 8. So God is angry at the friends and says, you didn't speak nechona about me. Not necessarily the truth about me, you didn't speak forthrightly out of a sense of insistence. It's not you didn't say the truth about me, but you didn't speak with me with trying to get at the core. You just spoke with the hearing of the ear. You didn't really go after it. Job was wrong, but he stood there with a certain kind of spiritual strength. So then he says, go to my servant Job and offer sacrifices. Deja vu, right? The son, he did this for his kids, right? Deja vu all over again, says Yogi Berra. And Job will pray for you. And I will forgive you. Now, what does Job do that is astonishingly new? And what do the friends do in response? Job intercedes with God for the friends. Having compassion for all, say, sentient creatures of dust and ashes, having seen what he sees, he prays for his friends. He brings them back into a human community. Because they spoke from where they stood, but they didn't speak rightly, but they spoke. And he has compassion, because they, like he, are simply dust and ashes. Right? So his first gesture, his first ethical spiritual gesture, after he says, I have compassion, or I relent my preceding hubris, is he turns that nechama, that relenting, into a compassionate gesture, and prays for his friends. Now notice what happens in verse 10. That when he is able to do that, when he is able, this is, I think you have to read it, this is the way I'm trying to read it. When Job is able to pray for his friends with his new spiritual insight, God restores what he has lost. He's given back the possibility of living in a human world. It's not just that he has all these goats and cattle. He's given the possibility not to be alone, which he was in his prior cry to God. Right? He's now reached out of the void of his own argument, which was self-centered, and now seeing God's otherness becoming descented from himself, he simply has praise for his friends. And he's given back a world. He's given back fellowship. Right? It's an astonishing thing. He's given back a world. Because up to this point, his debate with God had isolated him from the world. Right? And now he's given back a world, which will include a new family, but it fundamentally includes the world that he had pulled away from the friends. And now we see the most astonishing secondary change in verse 11. So all of his brothers and all of his sisters and everybody who knew him came and they ate with him. They ate in his house. And now they mourn with him and they have compassion for him over the disaster that he had suffered at God's hands. And they give each other gifts to bolster one another. Notice when Job is able to turn his private sorrow and complaint into compassion, and he intercedes with his friends, they can come and sit at his table and no longer argue with him, but cry over his loss and now have compassion for him. That's the language. And now they have compassionate sympathy for him. And then they exchange the gifts of loving kindness. Okay? And then Job goes on and he rebuilds his family. So there's something quite astonishing here, and then I want to hear your reactions to the whole. Something quite astonishing. That as his perspective changes, he's able to turn to humans in a new way and intervene with God, to care for those who were arguing with him up to this point, right? And then they eat, and now these people can cry with him. They're not just going to argue with him. They're going to cry with him, vayanudu, they're going to rock in mourning, vayinachamu, and they're going to give him consolation. And there's a re-establishment of the human community through compassion and care and fellowship. And then they give each other gifts. I mean, those are simply the external tokens of what they've just given each other. Loving kindness and care. The gifts are just another form of that expression in material terms. Right? And then he's able to go on and have a wife and have new children. Right? And to rebuild his life out of small things. Right? The rebuilding of his life was out of the smallest gesture of compassion. Right? And that becomes the new fundamental gesture. So if we say, and with this I'll conclude, if we keep this text alongside Sinai, there's an inner wisdom to Sinai that's now reflected at a totally different level. Right? It allows one to live within a new perception of God. Perhaps the turning back to the community means turning back to the communal covenant with a new orientation. Perhaps it doesn't. Perhaps this stands on its own. There's an incredible wisdom, though, isn't there, that the framers of the canon have kept this in the canon. Whether they wanted to keep this as a limit text so you don't take the covenant too far, or you're supposed to integrate that, that's for you to do on your own. Right? The canon is not telling you how to integrate the two, or where you put the emphasis at different times in your life, or whether you have to kind of smuggle Job into the covenant, so the covenant is now reformulated. But it's a new voice. It's not the voice of thou shalt and thou shalt not. So if we come back to that question, what do you do with that new knowledge? What would keep you is that you become aware that all creatures have the same place in the cosmos that Job has. And he takes his knowledge and he gives it in love, even to the people who have not had that experience. But it opens them up to loving kindness. And that becomes the new foundation principle of the rebuilding of their community. Right? Whatever laws unfold from that, this is the great commandment. Right? This is the great commandment. It's not simply the great commandment, you love your neighbor as yourself. But you have seen God with the seeing of the eye. And now you have compassion on humans. This is the new great commandment. Right? Which then has to take on its own law and tradition so that you can live it in a full way. But it's a recentering out of a totally new insight. So the human being is not thrown into an ego-centered void or into anarchy. But in the very same verb of penitence, nichamti, that turned, the same language of penitence is now turned into an ethical spiritual quality of compassion. The very same term is now revolutionized and transformed so that the human heart now reaches out. So seeing that does not remove him from the community. In a certain sense, it brings Job back. And God understands that. So when you say that he has not spoken nechona, all the commentators get a little bit stuck on that because he didn't speak the truth. How could he speak the truth if he was... But he didn't speak in a kind of upright, forthright manner. Right? And God acknowledges that. He did the best he could until he had this new vision. Right? And now with this new vision, he goes forward with a new theological ethics that's founded on this new insight. Nichamti. Right? I relent my older attempt to grab hold of existence, and I have compassion for all that extends beyond. At that point, and this will be our transit, we'll open it up to discussion, but this is the transition to next class, the issue of theodicy just falls away. It falls away. It only has sticking power when you're within a different form of argumentation. Within this new vision, theodicy is not in the game. It just falls away. It's an irrelevant issue for a new theological ethic. The end. Let's hope the author is right. At least it's helpful. And it gives a very deep wisdom. In other words, it's a wisdom that has a hint of the truth. Hopefully it has a lot of the truth. But that was the response I was making to Adrian. There's no claim that is the truth because it's not, but it's something that the tradition can give us as wisdom. Right? So what do you think?